I'm going to be talking today about LLM evaluation. And this is actually a talk that I gave about a month ago or it's a slight modification of a talk I gave about a month ago to some researchers who were really interested in AI for rare disease in general. So some of this has a rare disease flavor toward the end. I've trimmed that back a little bit and added some other things that I think are of interest. And this is a pretty high level overview. For those of you who've been working in LLMs for a long time, you might find a lot of this to be unsurprising, but maybe there's a couple interesting tricks that you'll pick up as well. So first up, I think we have to have an introductory slide about how cool LLMs are. If you're in this particular presentation, you probably don't need to be told this, but they are very cool. I think primarily because they really open up new possibilities that we couldn't do before. They're really great at processing unstructured text data, and they open up some really neat ways to interact with information, as a human. Of course, the issue, of course, is that we don't always trust them. And why should we trust them, right? I mean, they're trained on just terabytes of data that have been slurped up from the web and wherever else places can find them. And so it's really hard to know what data they've been trained on. There may be, a lot of inconsistencies or errors in there that could seep through. And they also have really opaque operation. We don't necessarily know what's going on inside of them in order to do what they do. I will say, though, that there's some really extremely cool work that's going on in LLM mechanistic interpretability. So if you want some Googleable terms, go check out mechanistic interpretability, where folks are actually trying to understand which individual neurons are firing and turning on and turning off, and how these things work deep down in their layers. So probing and activation engineering and knowledge editing is pretty cool. There's actually a technique out there wherein you can take a LLM and you can change one specific fact that LLM knows, and then that change of fact sort of generalizes, which is really cool. So check out knowledge editing. Beyond that, though, how can we gain some trust in our LLMs? Well, I think we can gain trust in our LLMs kind of like we gain trust in each other by testing and evaluating and maybe even credentialing. Now, there are a lot of different ways in which we can evaluate LLMs, and it's a little bit different. When I was putting this presentation together, I was sort of trying to put a categorization on these things, but it's tough because we evaluate LLMs in a lot of different dimensions, and those different dimensions intersect. But the first dimension in which I'll talk about is sort of like the big ways that we evaluate LLMs are, on the one side, benchmarking data sets and tasks. And these come in various kinds: multiple choice, open question and answer, summarization. And these can be for, general knowledge or very domain specific knowledge. And you can also sort of test different aspects of an LLM, right? Like, okay, are we going to test whether or not, or evaluate whether or not they know things, sort of intrinsically, or whether or not they can reason about things sort of intrinsically. On the other side of things, where I've put it, is human evaluation, right? And this is where we actually get real life, heart-beating humans to evaluate how LLMs are doing their job. And there's also sort of like kind of a stand-in an LLM as a judge, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And there are different ways to do human evaluation. A couple of the interesting ones that we won't talk a ton about are arena style and red teaming, but I do think it's worth mentioning them. So I don't know if you've seen this. There's this thing called the chatbot arena. And this is an online forum where you can go and you can pose questions to LLMs, and what come back to you are answers from those LLMs, but you don't actually know which LLMs are providing those answers, right? It's sort of blinded. And so I could go and I say, okay, what are the primary symptoms of long COVID? 2 sort of LLM models are chosen at random from the set that this arena knows about. It gives me the answers back, and then I can pick. Do I like A? Do I like B? Are they tied? Or are they both bad? And this is really cool because it sort of allows people to put up kind of a dashboard or a leaderboard. And so this is published. You can go and check out the leaderboard for the chatbot arena and see which models are currently sort of like winning in the reminds me of the old hotornot.com or whatever. The rankings for these do tend to be based on existing competition models. So a lot of them are based on the ELO ranking for chess, which I don't know a whole lot about, but it's a mathematical model for ranking players. And then there are also LLM specific variants that people are coming up with. So there's a modification of the ELO model for specifically for working on LLM variants that the folks at the Chatbot Arena have come up with. So there are pros and cons to this, of course. The pros are you get sort of real-time updates, right? Like, and when a new model comes out, if it is included in the chatbot arena, it's sort of included amongst the big competition, amongst all the LLMs, and you can sort of almost immediately start getting feedback from it. The con side of that is that it does take a little bit of time for that ranking to start working its way through the system, right? So until you have enough users voting on your particular LLM, you don't really know where it's going to stand in the rankings immediately. Another pro is that it's really realistic, right? Like you're getting actual questions from actual humans and they're providing their feedback in terms of which they prefer, one or the other. The downside, however, is it's not so reproducible, right? So if I say, hey, I have a brand new LLM, I can post it to the chatbot arena and other people can vote on it, but I can't necessarily go back in time and say, okay, a whole bunch of people have already voted on a bunch of, thousands of questions. How does my LLM do on that? Because you need this sort of continuous feedback from the people who visit and vote on answers. Another sort of interesting way that people evaluate LLMs is known as red teaming. And this is really just a really focused effort to find specific failure modes in large language models. Typically, this is associated with like dangerous things, like can I get the large language model to tell me how to create a nasty chemical substance? Can I get the LLM to generate propaganda that I know is false, stuff like that. A really good example of this is the GPT-4 system card. This is a white paper that was published along with GPT-4 by OpenAI, and they go through all kinds of different red teaming examples where they try to do all these really dangerous things, and then they talk about how they sort of mitigated those dangerous things in the version that they actually released to the public. However, I will also note that there's this other thing, peer review of GPT-4 technical report and systems card. So if you want to go and see sort of an academic perspective on this red teaming activity and its pros and cons, you can go and check out that paper. And I think we should be able to make these slides available so you can go and get access to all these papers. All right, so now we get into the more bread and butter of how we evaluate LLMs, and that is benchmark data sets, in particular, multiple choice benchmark data sets. So for example, we have a large data set here in the MMLU database, which has things like is in a Robertsonian translocation, fusion occurs at B, and then there's a set of choices, and you present the question and the set of choices to the LLM, and then you ask the LLM to pick a choice, and it's going to say, A, B, C, D, whatever it is. And there are lots of these out there. MMLU is a really common one that is used. It crosses a lot of different domains. So there's question banks around engineering, question banks about law, question banks around medical genetics. And then there are all focused data sets for this kind of thing. So MedQA and MedMCQA are medical focused questions. And a lot of these tend to be derived from existing data sources that are out there, right? Like a medical exam study guide that might be published on the web. Somebody went, scraped it, and generated a question and answer data set for this kind of thing. So with regard to multiple choice evaluations, there are some pros and cons of it, right? The first pro is that it's really easy to grade them because the AI either gives you a correct answer or it doesn't. And usually you can extract from the AI's answer whether it's trying to answer A, B, C, or D, even though it might say, well, I think the correct answer is B. It's a little bit of text, but you can sort of regex or just pull out the answer that you care about. These are also really nice because you can easily run new tests and compare models, right? So if Google has published their scores on the MedQA benchmark, I develop a new fancy model, I can run it against the MedQA benchmark and be like, look, I beat Google by 5%, look how awesome I am. Of course, the problem with these is that they're not as representative of real use cases, right? Like how often do I really want to talk to an LLM and present it with a multiple choice answer where one of those 3 or 4 or 5 answers is going to be the correct one? There are also benchmarks where we evaluate LLMs on sort of free text outputs. And this is more realistic, right? Where you sort of say, hey, what are the treatments for parasites and how do you prevent parasites of schistosomatiasis? And there are given answers that are expected, but of course, the answer that's provided by the LLM is not going to be exactly the expected answer. And so these are a lot harder to evaluate. On the plus side, we can also evaluate in this manner if we know how to evaluate them properly on a variety of different tasks. LLMs can do all kinds of things, right? They can answer questions, they can summarize text, they can translate from one language to another, and they can do things like code generation, right? And so you might say, okay, what's an SQL query that queries my OMOP database to pull out all these particular patients, and then you can evaluate that SQL query in some way to see if it did a good job. So here's a quick example from the MedQuad database. And as I mentioned, pros is it's more realistic and task flexible, but these are kind of difficult to bring. I'm mentioning some data sets here, and there are some really nice data set repositories that are out there. So if you want to go and just search for like, oh, I need to find a medical question answering data set that's specific to rare disease or something, Hugging Face publishes a really nice data set repository that you can both contribute to and download from. So does Papers with Code, which also has a little bit better facilities for linking the data sets with the original publications that generated them and the publications that might use them. So you might say, okay, I have this MedQuad data set. How many papers evaluated on the MedQuad data set? And you can go to Papers with Code and it'll, as best they can, at least tell you all the papers that evaluated on MedQuad. Okay, so in terms of scoring free text, there are some traditional quote unquote NLP methods. And I'm not a traditional NLP person. Probably the people who are traditional NLP people are a little bit annoyed that we're all NLP people now with LLMs. It's like, oh, there's an easy button. But this particular field has a variety of different statistics that are sort of computed around answers for these kinds of things. And these are more sort of statistical metrics. A couple of the biggest ones are Rouge and Rouge-L. And what these do is they sort of look at the reference answer and then the machine generated answer. And they look at how much of the real answer is actually in the model answer. And so this is good for like evaluation of summarizing text, right? It tends to be kind of recall oriented. Blue, on the other hand, looks at how much of the model answer is in the real answer. And this tends to be used for translation tasks and things like that. We want to be more precise or precision oriented. Since we care about these things generally in medical context, there's also a pretty cool one called MedCon. And what this does is it looks at a reference answer and a machine generated answer, and it looks for overlaps of UMLS terms specifically in the two. So it has a really medical oriented flavor to it. And they don't necessarily look at precision or recall alone. They use an F1 score, which kind of combines it for a more general evaluation. Okay, so now the other way that you can evaluate LLM models is to actually ask an LLM to evaluate for you, right? Humans are expensive. Let's ask the LLM to do it. And this comes in a few different flavors. The first one is this LLM as a judge, which is exactly what it sounds like. Humans are expensive. Let's ask an LLM to evaluate another LLM's answers. It's fairly promising, but there are some specific known issues with it. In particular, your evaluator AI, if it has particular biases in it, that can be a problem, right? Or if it's sensitive to phrasing or output length, which we kind of know that they are, in fact. So there have been papers that evaluate these things and say like, okay, LLMs prefer answers that are longer. It turns out that LLMs will prefer answers that have a correct answer of A. Because of the rank ordering of things, they tend to prefer first things. There's another one which is kind of neat, which is based on what we call embedding similarity. So if you're not familiar with this, what you can do with the large language model is you can take some input text and you shove it into the language model, which is this big neural network, right? And then somewhere along the midway or maybe toward the end of the language model, you pull out some of the numbers that it has transformed your input text into. And if you do this in the right way, and I'm wading over a lot of details here, those vector representations of numbers of your input text, you can then go and sort of cluster by them. And if you do this, you find out that input texts tend to cluster together. So input texts that this is a clustering, for example, of news articles. Input articles that are about crime and law are similar to other articles that are about crime and law. And so using an embedding similarity model is really just about, well, if I take a reference answer and I stick it into the language model and I find out where it lands in this big clustering space, and then I take, my AI answer and I run it through here and I find out where it lands in this big clustering space, I can get some sort of a metric about how similar the AI answer and the reference answer are in terms of the distance between them amongst these numeric representations. For what it's worth, we don't usually use regular generative language models. We tend to use models that are designed specifically to create these vector representations, which actually can look at texts that are both before and after when they do this. BERT is sort of like the original classic of this. And so BERT score is this idea of using the embedding distance. On the other hand, there are other publications that seem to indicate that there are biases in here as well. So there's a paper that talks about social bias in BERT score, things of this nature. And then in terms of model-based evaluation, there's also, this is a kind of a one-off thing, but it's something that's totally different, which I think is kind of cool. So one thing that LLMs, these generative ones like ChatGPT that we talked to, can generate, they can tell you what the next word or token is going to be, but they can also give a probability distribution over that. And generally, when they're generating, it's just going to say the next most likely thing, right? And so if it says the Burj Khalifa in Dubai is currently the world's tallest building, and then at this point, it has this distribution over these things that it's going to say, and it picks the most likely one, and then it continues on its way. But because they generate these probabilities, you can actually sort of get a sense of how likely a particular answer is in terms of this probability. And so what this method does is it says, okay, we have a desired answer, right? Like the reference answer. Let's actually go in and see if we can figure out what the probability of generating that reference answer is compared to some other reference answer or whatever it may be. So this is another interesting way to sort of evaluate LLMs by actually looking at the likelihood of generating the right quote unquote answer. All right, moving on, let's talk about a few more different kinds of human evaluations. These are, this is where you sit experts down. You get some people in a room, you have them sit down, they read AI answers, and they tell you how good they think they are. And often we have experts evaluate them along different dimensions, right? Is the answer accurate? Is it complete? Is it concise? Sometimes we care about that. And so here's an example from a paper that I really like, actually. This is a paper that did this kind of thing really well. And what they did is they had an AIs answer medical questions or do summaries. In this case, it's a summarization task. And they also had experts produce, expert-generated summaries. And then they had other experts look at the AI summary and the expert-produced summary and sort of tag things in terms of, okay, it was in the answer and in the reference answer. It was only in the expert answer. It was only in the AI answer. It was correct, and then flagging things for incorrectness. One of the things I like about this paper is they also compared these dimensions in terms of accuracy, completeness, conciseness against those traditional NLP metrics, right? Like Rouge and Blue, which just look at like term overlap. And they were able to sort of see whether or not expert-generated evaluations correspond to those traditional evaluation techniques. And they did find some good correspondence, but then in other cases, not so good correspondence. So since we're on the topic here, we've been talking about evaluating LLM answers, either in the context of like multiple choice or just in free text output. But LLMs can also do a variety of tasks that are sort of related to these things. And they have specific terms. And so you can use these terms to go and search Google Scholar for techniques that people do. One of them is called named entity recognition. This is really where you want to give an LLM some input, and you want the LLM to find the things in that input that are like proper names. And the output is not usually like the proper names in this text are X, Y, and Z. The The output is usually some sort of coded format, right? So like if I say the CGPT gene is responsible for yada, 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 I want to get out the fact that CGPT is a label and it exists from characters 5 to 8 in that input, and then so on and so on. And this can be really useful so that you can take this information and work with it furthermore programmatically down the line. Relatedly, there's a task known as entity normalization. And this is, the task of, okay, I have figured out the named entities. Now I want to actually standardize them in some way, right? So maybe my named entity recognition model has determined that high blood pressure is a named entity that should be dealt with. And maybe essential hypertension is a named entity that should be dealt with. But what I really need to do is normalize these to some standard vocabulary like ICD-10. There are benchmark available data sets for these as well. So you can go and find BELB, for example, which is a benchmark for entity normalization, I think. And then you get sort of really fancy things in this line, like relation extraction. Relation extraction is where you not only just want it to find the entities in the text and maybe normalize them to some consistent nomenclature, you actually want to identify relationships between those. Patient has essential hypertension. Patient does not have essential hypertension. Those are two very different things. And just noting that there's a patient and essential hypertension in your text aren't quite enough to tell you that those two things are different. And you can even go beyond that, where you actually try and take a text and sort of say, okay, I have this sort of structured data schema that I want to stuff input text into. How can we do this? This is a paper from a fellow lab of ours at LBNL who actually do this recursively. They take a chunk of text and they want to design this sort of specific data structure, and they start breaking down the data structure into smaller and smaller pieces so that they can fill in the blanks in this data structure. Okay. And then we have LLMs that we give access to other databases. We call these augmented LLMs. And if you're familiar with the acronym RAG for Retrieval Augmented Generation, usually this is done with an embedding similarity kind of thing like we saw earlier, but there are other ways to do it well. Regardless, the setup that we have is there's some sort of input text that we want to send to the language model, and we want to get the output text, right, the answer. But we also have some sort of a retriever, and the retriever's job is to look at an external database of information, find the information that matters, and then send it along with the input text to the language model, which we call context, so that the language model can say, okay, I happen to know that these diseases are caused by these genes, and so we'll provide it to the language model along with the user's question to generate the output. When you're dealing with systems like this, now you have all kinds of other interesting ways that you can evaluate LLMs. So, in particular, does the retriever fetch the correct info? And there's sort of a benchmark for this, but this turns out to be one of the more difficult things to do when generating a RAG system. So I have practical experience here. It works great when the retriever pulls the right information from the database. If the retriever pulls the wrong information from the database, your language model gets super confused and gives you gibberish. Of course, you can also still evaluate the output text, right? But now you have additional dimensions to evaluate them on. Is the output, faithfully including the context that was given to it? Is it including stuff that wasn't given to it in the context, right? So it's sort of making up things along the way as well. Is it actually using the context properly to answer the question? So these are all different questions that you might ask about a RAG-based LLM system. And there's a squad data set that you can go and check out, which is pretty popular for this kind of component, but of course there are lots of other ones that are similar. So returning back to this idea of benchmark data sets, especially those multiple choice benchmark data sets, these are really the go-to standard that people use for evaluating LLM because they're so easy, right? Data set, multiple choice answer, we got 82% accuracy, and you get figures like this from the Metatron paper that show how the performance of LLMs is doing on that MedQA benchmark in terms of proprietary models and open source models and how they've been improving over time and so on and so forth. Now remember, a lot of these are generated sort of programmatically or automatically, right? Like if I want a whole bunch of medical question and answers, and I don't want to go and bother an actual clinician to do this, I might go to a study guide for some particular medical licensing exam and pull those in and then turn those into question and answers and then use that to generate my benchmark data set. But there are a variety of issues with this. First off, they're not always comprehensive or realistic. Again, a study guide for some particular medical licensing examination might not be exactly the kind of thing that you would actually use in clinical practice, especially if it's phrased as a multiple choice question. The other problem that people have discovered is that these commonly have errors in them. So there's a paper recently that discovered that this very popular MMLU benchmark, depending on the set of questions that you're looking at, has varying levels of error. Overall, it's like a 9% error rate. And if you look at some of the specific ones, like in virology, it's 57% error rate. And so if an LLM claims to do 95% accuracy on this, I might say, well, that seems like it should be impossible. What's going on? We know that phrasing and formatting can influence results, right? So if you have a benchmark data set that's sort of like a free text answer and you want to evaluate it via that likelihood approach, LLMs have preferences for certain kinds of answers versus other answers, and it's not necessarily aligned with what we think they should be preferring. These data sets often have unclear provenance, so MedQA might publish that they got this particular information from that particular data source, but a lot of these don't have that provenance in them. And probably the biggest issue that we see is that of contamination. So, for example, if there was a benchmark data set that was generated from a medical licensing exam, and you go to ask your LLM and the LLM gets 95% accuracy, and you go, wow, my LLM is great at medical questions. That practice exam is probably out there on the internet, and the LLM was probably trained on that particular practice data set as well. And so you might say, well, how's it going to do on novel questions? Is it just sort of memorizing and repeating, or is it able to deal with novelty? Frankly, there's also the issue that they're becoming too easy. Even for good data sets, we're getting to the point now where like LLMs are, competing for 95% accuracy versus 96% accuracy. And so now there's actually like papers out there that are like, here's a brand new, really hard benchmark that people can start working against. And there are too few, especially for specific areas. I designed this talk to talk about rare diseases. There aren't very many benchmarks out there for rare diseases. Here's a couple of interesting review papers if you want to go and read more systematic review and inadequacies of large language model benchmarks and so on. Okay, so I promised that this is going to be a little bit about rare diseases. So here's a particular benchmark that's sort of related to rare diseases. This is called the Gene Touring Benchmark. And it consists of 12 modules of, I think, 50 or 100 questions each now. And these modules generally deal with sort of genetic and genomic information, right? So like what genes are causing Wilson's disease? And that's supposed to give you the gene names that cause Wilson's disease. I have a gene SNAT6. What's the official name for it? And it tells you what the official name is. You can even do things like, is this gene protein coding? Or here's a snippet of DNA sequence. Can you go and tell me which chromosome and gene that exists in? And so it's meant to be this very general benchmark data set for genetic and related information. And it sources from a variety of different sources. There's databases out there, OMEM for rare disease information, NCBI, GenCode, and so on. So to give you a little personal story here, a little while ago, I put together a fairly simple LLM agent. And what this thing does is it meant to answer sort of medical questions about diseases. And our group works on something known as the Monarch Knowledge Graph, which incorporates information from all kinds of databases out on the web about diseases, about genes that cause them, about the phenotypes that you see when you have those diseases, and how the genes might contribute to those phenotypes, as well as all kinds of other information. It's a really big resource. And so I built this little chatbot that is sort of a retrieval augmented generative thing. It can query the Monarch KG, pull in context, answer the user's question, and generate an answer. And so I wanted to evaluate it, right? This is what you want to do. I put together a new AI system, so I want to see how good it does. And there's not a lot out there for these kinds of questions that the Monarch Knowledge Graph can do. So I went and I found this gene touring database, and I was able to sort of evaluate how well it did on that particular benchmark data set. There's a problem. Those gene Turing questions, as I mentioned, were sourced from OMIM, NCBI, other databases like that. The Monarch Knowledge Graph is sourced from many of the same sources. So, and when I am evaluating how well my agent plus knowledge graph does on those questions, am I really getting a fair evaluation or not? And at this point, I think it's almost philosophical. All right, there are 3 or 4 other rare disease benchmark data sets. I trimmed out all but this other one here, which is really just a collection of data sets that, a collection of questions that come from other benchmark databases that are specific to rare diseases. But this does go to show that just generating a benchmark data set is sort of a publishable thing. People need benchmark data sets in order to evaluate their LLMs against, and they're not out there. A couple other things, just related benchmarks that you might be interested. There's Clinical Bench, which sort of looks at the mimic tabular ICD coded EHR data and generates question and answer tasks from it. PediaBench is sort of a pediatrics focused question and answer data set. Sourced from, again, licensing exams, treatment guidelines, stuff that you might actually be able to find on the internet already and might be part of your training corpus for your LLM. So I mentioned that generating benchmarks is a fairly publishable thing. Like you could get a group of people together and say, we're going to generate a brand new benchmark and we're going to publish it so that other people can use it. Great way to publish a paper and get a handful of citations, maybe a lot of citations. And so you might ask, are there recommendations for creating benchmarks out there? And there are some. Here's some papers to them here that shows, some examples of how you might want to do this. Down here at the bottom is an interesting one, GPQA, a graduate level Google proof Q&A benchmark. They actually generated benchmark questions and then they took those benchmark questions and they sat down somebody, like a grad student, with Google and gave them 30 minutes to try and answer these questions. And if they couldn't, it made it into the benchmark data set. So these are really, really hard questions. In terms of other, best practices in creating a benchmark data set, things you might want to consider doing if you're going to do this is track the sources of information that you're getting them from, right? This metadata might be useful in the future. If you're having experts provide questions and answers, you might want to track what their expertise is so that you can say, well, questions generated by medical professionals are easier than questions generated by machine learning engineers. And you can also sort of identify biases and trends that way. Definitely try and do de novo text that's not already published on the web. And you may still want to evaluate the de novo text that you do generate to see how similar it is to stuff that is on the web. So this is sort of something that people will do. They'll generate a brand new benchmark data set, and then they'll say, okay, then we did a comparison of terabytes of data, and we found that 5% of the text overlapped, so we removed those questions just by chance, and then we continue on. And then, of course, make them hard and realistic. You might also want to consider varying the phrasing and the format of your questions. Maybe make a multiple choice version of it and a free text version. Make a version that uses lay language and make a version that uses expert language. Make some that are short questions and long questions, because these biases are in LLMs and we don't necessarily know what they are. Whereas if you have this variation, we can start to understand what kinds of biases LLMs might have. And you also might want to plan for the future, right? So the 2024 version of our benchmark data set, eventually LLMs are going to be doing 98% accuracy on it. So we might want to actually plan to, in a couple of years, augment it with new questions, updated stuff. Okay, so this is sort of a collection of stuff that I've not yet categorized or really gone through to put in this particular presentation, but I thought it'd be interesting. I did find, which I had not previously found, there's a conference on research and development in information retrieval. This is a ACM special SIG. And so this is the proceedings of it last year have just dozens of papers in it, all about evaluation of LLMs, including a special section just on evaluation with and for LLMs, but also a whole bunch of other things too. They do tend to be sort of RAG kind of focused because this is a conference on information retrieval. Here's a nice review paper, current and future state of evaluation of language models. It also interestingly has some evaluation of different training methodologies. So we don't often think about, I have an LLM that's been pre-trained, I can use it. We can also take that LLM and train it a little bit more. And we use methods like that called fine tuning or preference optimization. And so this paper actually does a review of evaluation of them, including techniques where researchers have done some fine tuning or some direct preference optimization on their large language models. Can LLMs generate good questions based on context? So this is sort of like, can I use an LLM to generate questions to benchmark other LLMs? And then very, very recently, perhaps you may have heard large language models pass the Turing test. That's debatable. What they did is they actually did a pre-registered randomized control trial where they had individuals chat with either an LLM or with a real human, and they gave them 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, that person had to sort of say which one was the human, which one was the LLM. And this is what they're using in their claim that they passed the Turing test because they didn't do very well. I do like the fact that this is sort of a randomized controlled trial. These things are expensive, but I think that actually using them in practice in the way that we evaluate, things, the gold standard, the randomized controlled trial is something that we should think about more with LLMs. Okay, that's it. How about you can share screen after, but I show.
Do you want to switch over to the demo?
Sure. Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
All right. So this is maybe not directly super related, but so you remember I mentioned that knowledge graph, and I have an agent which can query that knowledge graph. And I evaluated on the Gene Turing benchmark, and sort of it did good, but it's like, well, are we sure that it did good? The problem that I had with that particular iteration of the agent was actually really, really simple. It could only do very simple things. It could look up for a given disease, the connected phenotypes or genes. For a given phenotype, look at the connected phenotypes of genes. And for a given disease, look at anyway, it can look for direct connections between phenotypes, genes, and diseases. But the knowledge graph is very sophisticated, right? It's got lots of information in it. And so I really wanted to know, can I design an LLM that would query the knowledge graph using the graph query syntax that the graph uses? It's turned out to be a lot harder than I imagined, so I've been tinkering with this for a while, but I'll just show you an example. What phenotypes are associated with more than one subtype of EDS? So EDS is the acronym for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it comes in a variety of different subtypes. There's EDS1, EDS2, EDS2 subtype B, all kinds of things like that. And so what this particular agent is doing is it's first done something interesting. It's searching for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So it knew that I meant Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and decided to search for that particular thing so it could look up the identifier for it. And then it generated, I did a bad job here. See, I'm still tinkering. And then it generated a query and ran that query against the database and summarized the results. But what I found is that they're actually pretty bad at generating these queries. And so what I did is I actually inject another LLM in the middle. So there's an LLM which takes the query that was generated by the first agent, summarizes it, and then provides suggestions for improvement, and then decides whether or not it should be accepted or not. And this one did decide that this particular query should be accepted, even though I know it got the wrong answer because I know that there are not 342 subtypes of EDS. So still iterating on this, but this is the kind of agent-based things that you can do, injecting an agent in your loop, so on and so forth. So that was just a little demo that I wanted to show.
What's the UI for that?
This is Streamline. See if it can.
Oh,
tell me.
they're not seeing anything on screen for the demo?
I think we have two different screens.
Oh, I'm not sharing, am I?
You are sharing, but
Yeah, I was seeing it.
yeah,
I'm seeing it on mine right now. They might have to click over. I see any problem.
I was sharing the wrong screen.
Oh,
This
yeah,
is the one.
there were two different.
maybe, do you just want to go through that one more time?
Sure.
In
So this is
version.
my little demo chatbot. Doesn't do all that great. But if I search for this, it's first going to look up the identifier for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome in the database, and then once it does, it's going to generate a graph query, and then it's actually going to ask another AI agent whether or not that query and the results that it returns are good and sensible and plausible. And that other agent is supposed to say yes or no, and if it says no, the first agent will have to go back and try again. In this case, it looks like it has approved it, and we can actually see the evaluation that was in there. So the agent generated this particular query of the knowledge graph to pull out all that information. Another agent provided some potential suggestions, but also said that it was acceptable to run and return to the user. And then that information was provided to the original AI so that it could summarize it. I also have a little functionality for it to visualize this. We'll see if it gets it right. And so this does illustrate with these retrieval augmented generation things, like they either nail the question or they totally blow it. Because if it pulls the wrong information, totally blows it. Pulls the right information, nails it. Yeah. Blow. So this time my secondary thing said no. So still in development.
When you, when it's submitting the query and generating that, what syntax is it generating?
That is Cypher, which is a query syntax for Neo4j.
Okay, so it's graph specific.
Yeah.
Or even is that Neo4j specific?
It's graph specific,
Okay.
and Neo4j is the most popular graph database that uses it, but there are some other ones. They're much better at SQL. If you have an SQL database and you want to get an agent to query it, they're pretty good at that.
I was curious too, I know I've seen something similar, but to generate Sparkle. And it's been okay with Sparkle.
Yes, I've seen such things too.
Yeah. Cool, thank you very much for presenting. I'll open it up if there are questions or other comments, thoughts from the audience, either in person or on chat.
I had a really general question. So you discussed like so many different ways that LLMs can be evaluated. And I was curious if there are any kind of centralized resources maybe online that summarize a lot of different benchmarking results or other evaluation results for maybe at least more common models.
Aside from like review papers and databases of benchmarking data sets like Hugging Faces, I don't really know of any centralized thing. There are also some good like blog posts out there, like how we evaluate large language models that are sort of surveys, but beyond that, I don't really know of anything.
It seems like a little bit of a gap if many different people are trying to evaluate models, but we can't kind of get all the results together in one place for somebody to really see a nice summary.
Yeah, papers with code for benchmarking data sets that are multiple choice. Papers with code does do a cool thing where like if you have med MCQA multiple choice question and answer, papers with code tracks which papers are citing it as well as the performance of those papers. So you can go and look at that particular benchmark data set and then see how 20 different papers have done on that particular benchmark data set. I don't know how they're doing that. If that's human curated, I imagine they have AI help. So it's probably missing some papers that are out there on archive and haven't, been picked up by them, but there is that at least.
I mean, that was, I would say, focused a little bit more on the academic side of things. On the non-academic side, there are a whole wide variety of things. So I think I, even in a previous seminar, had talked about Chatbot Arena, LLMarena.ai, which is much more of like a non-academic crowdsourcing approach of.
I think you might have been downstairs when
Yeah.
he presented that part.
Oh, okay, got it. Yes, well, I second that. Cool.
Well, thank you, everybody. Been enjoyed talking to you. This is a really big research space which I think is maybe surprising to me when I started really digging into it.
Yeah.
It feels like it'd be a small niche in the whole like LLM world. But there's a lot to say and a lot of research being done on how do we tell if these things are doing a good job or not.
Do you get any sense for whether it's largely academics pushing this space versus like the big AI companies?
My sense is that it's academics, and insofar as it's big AI companies, when they're allowed to publish in academic journals, then yeah. But OpenAI sort of and Google used to publish in academic journals, and now they're much more close to the chest. And I feel like they're also not publishing maybe their evaluation results as freely either. All
right. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Shawn, for presenting. And next month, we'll be giving a seminar on May, focused on introducing EHR data and applications. So see everyone then. Thank you.